How you going, guys, and welcome back to another video. On this one I want to talk a little bit about epoxy primer and etch prime. Now I'm on Facebook on this group called Australian Restorations. Now there's always guys asking questions about epoxy, etch, should you rust treat, should you do this, should you do that. Now in this video I want to give you a brief little guide on why you should choose etch prime over epoxy and epoxy over etch prime. Now, let's get it started right now. Now, I'll be covering a few basic little guides here. Now, we're going to be talking a little bit about stainless, aluminium, and mild steel. Now these are three completely different substrates which require their own special primer. Now I wouldn't recommend using a epoxy primer on aluminium and stainless. It's a bit of a waste. It's not really suited for it. Doesn't have the etching properties in that primer to suit the substrate. Now epoxy primer is non-porous, which means moisture can't get soaked into that primer and go up underneath and sit on top of the steel that you've put it on. Now, that's a really good product to use on mild steel which actually rusts over time. So if you're painting something that's aluminium and stainless, well, those don't actually rust. So using a etch primer is more suited. Etch primer is actually porous, which means moisture can get soaked in through that and will sit on top of your aluminium and stainless, but it won't actually rust because those substrates don't actually rust. So when it comes to choosing the right primer for your car, it is a really good idea when you're doing any bare metal projects that you do rust treat it, rust convert it, whether it's a dioxidine or a rust converter. You've got to use a epoxy primer, guys. Now look, I'm on a Facebook page called Australian Restorations, and there's a lot of DIY guys out there who are doing things themselves and they kind of don't have the knowledge behind them to get their job done up to a really good standard. Now whether they're going for a elite top 60 car or they're going for just a cruiser on weekends, they're not after spending a lot of money on it, it still pays to choose the right primer on your car, because it doesn't matter if it's a 200k job or a 30k job or even a 10k job. Choosing the right primer is key, because you don't want to have to spend that money again, bare metaling the whole car again and redoing it properly. So just covering what I've previously said, if you're going to be using a epoxy primer, well, epoxy is non-porous, which means it's suited for metals which rust. If you're using a etch primer, that's suited for aluminium and stainless. So whether you're painting sandblasted alloy wheels or things like that, then using an etch prime is really, really good and has the etching properties for the aluminium and the stainless, where the epoxy has the etching properties suited for your mild steel. Alright, so to give you a bit of a look at these parts, I'll throw some footage up on the screen. Now, I put these parts in epoxy primer. I think I made a video about that. Now, the reason why I chose epoxy is because these parts are mild steel, which means they will rust if we don't seal down the steel properly. So, how do you go about sanding down that epoxy to suit a high build primer later on? Now, there's quite a few different grits of sandpaper out there, and depending on what method of sanding you're actually doing, whether it's a sanding block like a speed file, big kit blocks or Dura blocks, no matter. Even if it's like an orbital sander, choosing the right grit is important. Now, 9 times out of 10, whenever I'm personally sanding down any epoxy, depending on what the part's shape is, what the quality of the metal is like underneath, meaning has it got dents or is it pretty straight, determines on what grit of sandpaper I use. Now, 9 times out of 10, if I just want to scuff down the surface, sand it with a block, just so I can see how straight it is, then 9 times out of 10, I'll use either 180 or 240. 9 times out of 10, it's always 240. If I'm confident the parts are dead straight, I'll block it with 240. Now what that is actually doing is highlighting any imperfections in the panel, but also it's keying up the surface suitable for a HS primer, which happens next. Now let's say that you're doing some filler repairs. You know that your parts have dents on it. What kind of grit do you need to use to get etch for your body filler? Now you can pretty much, depending on how many coats of epoxy you put on it, determines what grit of sandpaper you should use. Now I personally, if I know I'm using body filler, I'll be blocking with either 120 or 180. If I jump down to 240, I'm a firm believer of 240 isn't really suitable for a filler, like a body filler. Now fine feels a little bit different. That's why I was stumbling there a little bit. Fine feels a little bit different. Fine feel will pretty much stick to anything from 320, 240, 400, around there. When it comes to like body fillers, actual fillers, then either 120 or 180 is suitable. So that's when I would block down something with 180, find all my highs and lows, all those low spots which haven't been sanded. I generally get a piece of 180 or 120 by hand and just scuff up the surface, knowing where those areas are so I can put some filler on. Now I hope you're all following along. It is pretty straightforward. Now I have been doing it a long time. If you guys are DIY guys, start the video over and re-watch it. But yeah, so pretty much all these parts here that I sanded in my shed at home, I'll throw some footage up on the screen right now of me doing that if you haven't already been seeing that. So yeah, I block sand these blocks down with 180 and the area on one of the ends, I sanded it down with 240. Sorry, I've done it like 2 weeks ago. I sanded it down with 240 over everywhere, and then I used 180 where the repair was. Now that has made me get adhesion and etch of my body filler in that area. Now it's pretty much time. These parts have been in my office for about 2 weeks. I'm finally got time to make a video and get them in primer. Now I've got a few other things I want to prime and paint today, so I'm going to have a booth full of stuff. I won't be putting everything in this video. I will be making a separate video on painting the bonnet, which you may see some footage of later in the video. Now with that said guys, I'll give you a quick little look at when I swing the camera around. So there's the parts. So all these parts need is a wax and grease remove, and they're pretty much right to start HS priming. Now there's a couple of little areas on it where I need to go around with red Scotch-Brite, and that's just around like these little areas here. You can see that dark area around that stud. So they're the areas I've got to go around with red Scotch-Brite. That will give enough etch or scratches on the surface to give me adhesion when I go and put my HS primer or high build primer down. Our little like repair there is all nice and smooth and dead straight. The scratches that you're seeing there is actually 240. I don't know if they're coming up on camera. There we go. So they're 240 scratches. I blocked all these parts down with 240, but then went over it again with 240 on an orbital sander. So yeah, they're pretty much ready to go, guys. Now, I've also got a helmet here, which I actually painted yesterday, all with aerosol cans for a video for DNA, but I actually butchered it. The color combination was all up the shit. It didn't look very good. So I've decided that I'm gonna sand it down and prime it again. I used a 1K primer on it, which is usually pretty good, but on fresh paint, it's not a very good primer to use. You really got to use a 2K primer, not a 1K primer. So I actually got a lot of fry-ups on it. I don't know if you can see that on camera. See all the fry-ups? It looks like crazy cracking and all the rest of it. So that's a chemical reaction with a 1K primer over fresh sanded paint. So the way that we're going to fix it is to basically 2K prime it. So I'll use the same primer as I'm going to use on these parts here. Now with that said guys, that pretty much covers everything I really wanted to talk about. So pretty much if you're wanting to paint something that's bare steel, like mild steel, then make sure you use a epoxy primer. If you're painting something that's aluminium and stainless, then use an ETCH primer. Now there's a lot of primers out there. Some aren't wet on wet. Some of them you do need to apply and sand. The DNA Paints epoxy and ETCH primer can be mixed in a way that it is wet on wet, which means you can apply the primer and then let it sit for about 15 minutes and then start painting your base coats. But yeah, that's pretty much it, guys. We're going to start mixing up our primer and then apply between 3 and 4 coats over these parts and that helmet. Let's go. All right, guys, primer's all stirred up, got no big chunky bits in it. It's all nice. So this is the DNA Paints HS primer. It can be mixed 2 different ways. 4:1, no reducer for a high build application. I recommend using anywhere from a 1.7 up to 2 mil for the high build application. I will be spraying it with a 1.7 lot today, and the other way of mixing this primer is 4:1 to 1, which turns it from a primer into a primer surfacer. If you see on the label there, it says high build primer on the left and then primer surfacer there. So what a surfacer is technically you basically put it on like all your little rub throughs before you want to paint, give it a bit of a scuff, and you're right to continue painting. Now what I've done in the past is actually use it as a wet on wet primer. Now we've done adhesion tests and stuff like that, and it is suitable for that too. So we're gonna take this primer up to the 2. Let's get a rag, wipe up my mess. I hate making a mess in this paint room. We're gonna use a primer hardener, medium. We've got a fast there too. I might just use a medium. So we'll take that up to the next one. Like that. So that is suited for things that maybe have a few ripples on it. Your filler work's not 100%. You want to use a high build primer to try and block it out and get it straight. That's what a high build primer's for. Now I'm pretty confident, 100% confident that my repairs are pretty good. So we're just gonna prime it 4:1 to about 10 to 15% of reducer. So it's important that you do use a primer reducer, and it doesn't look like I have any here, which means I need to go get some. I'll be right back. All right, I found some. So we're gonna take that up to halfway between the next 2. So that's 15% of reducer. I will give this a stir up, and as I said, we're gonna be using a 1.7 mil spray gun to prime these parts. Now the gun of choice for today is the Welcome X Lite, and we're going to be using that. So that's going to be a 1.7 mil. In regards to the gun setup, I'll put it on the screen when we go and paint, but generally it's about 4 to 5 turns out, fan open, and roughly 18 to 22 psi.